imagine a wall of black water, 5 stories high, screaming out of the midnight Atlantic. Now imagine staring into that abyss while standing on a deck of creaking oak, knowing that just a few miles to your east, the jagged granite teeth of the French coast are waiting to tear your world apart. This isn't just a storm, and this isn't just a shipwreck. This is the most audacious naval duel in the history of the Age of Sail. If you value the grit, the glory, and the cold hard steel of British naval history, then hit that subscribe button right now, because we are going back to 1797, to a night where the rules of war were tossed into the furnace of a hurricane. The legend tells us that a tiny British frigate, the HMS Indefatigable, did the impossible. It hunted down and destroyed a French ship of the line, a massive double-decked fortress called the Droits de l'Homme. In the rigid hierarchy of the 18th century, this simply did not happen. It was tactical suicide. A frigate attacking a 74-gun ship of the line was like a modern-day police cruiser trying to pit maneuver a main battle tank. It was madness. Pure, unadulterated madness. But what if I told you the legend hides a much darker, much more technical truth? You see, the myth suggests it was a simple case of British bravery overcoming French size. But the reality? The reality was a masterclass in psychological warfare and environmental exploitation. Sir Edward Pellew, the man at the center of this storm, wasn't just brave. He was a predator. He didn't just fight the French. He used the very ocean as his primary weapon. Think about the modern world for a second. We look at the ship of the line as a museum piece, something dusty and silent. But in 1797, that ship was the most complex, most expensive, most lethal piece of technology on the face of the earth. It was the nuclear deterrent of its day. The Droits de l'Homme carried enough firepower to level a small city. And yet, on this night, in the middle of a screaming gale, that power became a liability. The myth often forgets the cost. We love the patriotic victory, but we rarely talk about the over 1,000 souls, British and French alike, who were swallowed by the surf in the aftermath. We talk about the medals, but we forget the splinters, those 6-inch long shards of oak that turned every cannon shot into a localized tornado of death. As we peel back the layers of this story, we find a modern connection that is impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a battle of ships. It was a battle of systems. It was the lean, fast, agile startup of the Royal Navy taking on the bloated, heavy, legacy corporation of the French Revolutionary Fleet. And the result? Well, the result changed the way the world looked at naval power forever. The Indefatigable wasn't even supposed to be there. Pellew was supposed to be a scout, a set of eyes for the main fleet. But Edward Pellew was never a man who liked to just watch. He was a man of action. A man who had once famously dived into a raging sea just to save a common sailor. That's the kind of spirit we're dealing with here. A man who looked at a hurricane and saw an opportunity. So, as the winds pick up and the spray turns to ice on the rigging, let's look past the oil paintings and the romantic poetry. Let's look at the cold, hard, tactical reality of two giants colliding in the dark. It's a story of hubris, it's a story of physics, and above all, it's a story of the resolute British heart. The stage is set, the storm is howling, and the hunt is finally about to begin. To understand this battle, you first have to understand the man. And to understand Sir Edward Pellew, you have to forget everything you think you know about the stuffy, lace-cuffed, aristocratic officers of the 18th century. Pellew was something different. He was a force of nature. He was a man who, quite literally, carved his own path out of the granite of the Cornish coast. Born into a family with no great wealth and no powerful titles, Pellew didn't purchase his rank. He earned it with calloused hands and a mind like a razor. If you were a sailor on his deck, you didn't just respect him, you were awed by him. Why? Because Edward Pellew could outclimb, outsail, and outfight any man in his crew. There's a famous story, almost a myth, but it's entirely true. During a violent storm, while his ship was being tossed like a toy, he saw a young midshipman frozen with fear high up in the rigging. Did Pellew shout orders from the safety of the quarterdeck? No. He stripped off his coat, climbed into the howling wind, and performed the task himself, 100 feet above the crashing waves. He was the expert next door before the term existed, but with a deadly edge. He possessed a tactical masterclass of a brain, one that understood the physics of a ship as if the wood and hemp were extensions of his own body. In the modern world, we'd call him a disruptor. He didn't care for the old way of doing things if the old way was slow or inefficient. He was obsessed with precision. Let's talk about money for a moment, because it grounds the scale of his responsibility. Losing a ship like the Indefatigable wasn't just a military failure, it was a financial catastrophe for the British taxpayer. In today's money, we're talking about a platform worth upwards of £60 million. And the Admiralty handed the keys to this self-made, aggressive, restless man. It was a massive gamble. Pellew's nemesis wasn't just the French, it was the very idea of mediocrity. He drilled his crews until they could fire their great guns in their sleep. While other captains were content with a broadside every few minutes, Pellew's men were a rhythmic, lethal machine. They could reload and fire with a speed that left the enemy, quite literally, breathless. But there was a quirk to his character, a human side that made him a legend. He was famously compassionate. He once spent his own prize money, a fortune that would be worth millions today, to ensure that the widows of his fallen sailors were cared for. He was a man of grit, but he was also a man of profound heart. It's this combination that made him the perfect architect for the impossible battle. He knew his men would follow him into the mouth of hell, because they knew he'd be the first one through the door. He was a man who understood the value of every rope, every nail, and every life, and as he stood on the deck of the Indefatigable, peering through his glass at the French horizon, he wasn't just looking for a fight. He was looking to prove that a man's worth wasn't defined by his birth, but by his resolute determination to win. You see, Pellew was a master of the calculated risk. He knew exactly how much his ship could take. He knew exactly when the wood would groan and when it would snap. This technical mastery, combined with an almost reckless bravery, made him the most dangerous man in the English Channel. He was the sword, and the Indefatigable was his edge. As we look at his lineage today, it's no surprise that his name still carries weight. You'll find statues of him, and his descendants have continued to serve the crown with that same fiery spirit. He was the man the 19th century needed, a hero built for an age of revolution. And now, with the man defined, it's time we look at the machine he commanded. Because the Indefatigable wasn't just a ship, it was a technological marvel, a Razee that shouldn't have existed. If you were to stand on a dock in 1797, looking at the HMS Indefatigable, you'd notice something was off. She didn't look like the other frigates. She was lower, meaner, and carried a predatory silhouette that whispered of a very specific kind of violence. That's because she was a Razee. In the language of the 18th century shipyard, to Razee meant to cut down. Imagine taking a massive, 3-story house and simply soaring off the top floor. That's exactly what the British Admiralty did to the Indefatigable. She started her life as a 64-gun ship of the line, a heavyweight boxer. But she was sluggish, slow, and old-fashioned. So, they took the saws to her. They stripped away her upper deck, lightened her load, and transformed her into the world's first true super frigate. This was a technical masterclass in recycling. By removing the weight of that top deck, the ship sat higher in the water. She became faster, more agile, and crucially, she could carry much heavier guns than a standard frigate. While her French counterparts were mostly armed with 12 or 18-pounder cannons, The Indefatigable were sporting 24-pounders. These weren't just guns, they were beasts. Think of it in modern terms. A standard frigate was like a high-speed pursuit vehicle armed with a submachine gun. The Indefatigable? She was a Ferrari, with the main gun of a battle tank bolted to the hood. But then, we have the nemesis, the Droits de l'Homme. If the Indefatigable was a scalpel, the Droits de l'Homme was a sledgehammer. She was a 74. That number 74 was the gold standard of naval power. It meant 74 massive cannons spread across 2 complete gun decks. She was a floating fortress of oak, built with a single purpose: to stand in the line of battle and trade punches with the greatest ships in the world. To put the scale into perspective, the Droits de l'Homme carried over 700 men. That's an entire village, living, eating, and fighting on a wooden island. The cost of building and maintaining a ship of this size today would be staggering, easily upwards of £150 million. When Pellew looked at her through his glass, he wasn't just looking at an enemy ship. He was looking at a massive investment of the French Republic, but there was a fatal flaw in the fortress. You see, on a ship of the line, the heaviest guns, the real ship killers, are located on the lower deck. These gun ports are only a few feet above the waterline. In a calm sea, this is fine. But in a hurricane, in a screaming Atlantic gale, if you open those lower ports, the ocean doesn't ask for permission. It just rushes in. This is the technical breaking point of the entire story. The Droits de l'Homme had 74 guns, but in a storm, she could only safely use the ones on her upper deck. Suddenly, the giant was fighting with one arm tied behind its back. Meanwhile, the Razee, Indefatigable, being lighter and more buoyant, could still work her heavy 24-pounders without the risk of foundering. It was a classic case of over-specialization. The French ship was designed for the grand, orderly battles of the mid-ocean, not for a knife fight in a phone booth during a blizzard. Logistics-wise, the British had another hidden advantage: the flintlock. While many French crews were still using slow-burning match to fire their cannons a nightmare in a wet, spray-filled gale, the British had moved toward flintlock triggers. It was faster, more reliable, and allowed for point-blank timing. So, we have the matchup. On one side, the heavy, prestigious, but lumbering fortress. On the other, the lean, modified, and technically superior frigate. It was a battle of mass versus velocity, and as any physicist will tell you, in a collision, velocity is a terrifying thing. The stage is set. The machines are ready. But before a single shot could be fired, the politics of 2 nations had to collide, because this wasn't just a random encounter. It was the desperate climax of a failed invasion. To understand why Pellew was hunting in a hurricane, we have to look at the map of Europe in 1796. It was a tinderbox. The French Revolution hadn't just decapitated a king. It had unleashed a predatory energy that threatened every throne in the world. The French Republic was desperate, and a desperate enemy is a dangerous one. Their plan? The expedition to Ireland. The goal was to land 15,000 veteran French troops in Bantry Bay, ignite an Irish rebellion, and kick the legs out from under the British Empire. If they had succeeded, the history of the United Kingdom would have ended right there in the mud of Cork. But, as is so often the case in naval history, the great plan met the great reality of the British weather. The expedition was a disaster before it even saw a coastline. The French fleet was scattered by relentless winter gales. Ships were lost, signals were missed, and the High Command was in a state of total, screaming chaos. This is where the nemesis factor comes in. The Droits de l'Homme wasn't just patrolling. She was part of this fractured invasion force, trying to limp back to France with her tail between her legs. Now, look at the British side. You might think the Royal Navy was a perfectly oiled machine, but the politics behind the scenes were just as messy as the French Revolution. There was a massive rivalry, a friction, between the aggressive frigate captains like Pellew and the cautious, aging admirals back in London. Admiral Colpoys, the man in charge of the blockade, had completely lost track of the French. He was sitting out at sea, watching the wrong patch of water, while the French fleet slipped right past him. The British Admiralty was humiliated. The newspapers were baying for blood. The pressure on the remaining British ships to find and neutralize the French was immense. Pellew was essentially operating on a long leash. He was the commander of the Western Frigate Squadron, an elite group of sea wolves tasked with being the eyes and ears of the fleet, but for a man like Pellew, being the eyes wasn't enough. He knew that if the Droits de l'Orme reached the safety of a French port, she would live to fight another day. She would be repaired, refitted, and sent back to threaten British shores. There's a modern bridge here that is worth noting. Think of the intelligence failures before a major conflict. The "where were the ships?" questions that haunt politicians. The British government in 1797 was facing that exact crisis. If Pellew failed, it wouldn't just be a lost battle. It would be a political catastrophe that could have toppled the government of William Pitt the Younger. The friction wasn't just with the enemy. It was with the rules of engagement. Standard naval doctrine said, you wait for the line of battle. You wait for the heavy hitters to arrive. But Pellew knew the heavy hitters weren't coming. It was just him, his partnership, the HMS Amazon, and the looming shadow of the French giant. He was faced with a choice that every great commander must eventually face. Do you follow the safe orders and let the enemy escape? Or do you risk your ship, your crew, and your reputation on a gamble that defies every manual in the library? Pellew chose the gamble. He chose to treat the Droits de l'Orme not as a superior force, but as a target. He saw the political desperation of the French. He saw the technical weakness of their water-clogged gun decks, and he decided that the impossible was actually necessary. The politics had set the fuse. The storm was the oxygen, and on the afternoon of January 13th, the spark was finally struck. The chase was over. The fight for survival was about to begin. Imagine the tension on the deck. The men knew they were outnumbered, they knew the political stakes, but they also knew the man standing on the quarterdeck. As the French coast appeared as a dark, jagged line on the horizon, Pellew gave the order to clear for action. The tinderbox was about to explode. The sun was dipping toward a horizon that didn't exist, swallowed by a sky the color of a bruised lung. It was 5:30, midwinter, and the Atlantic was no longer a sea. It had become a moving mountain range of freezing, salt-heavy black water. Through the stinging spray, the lookout on the Indefatigable squinted into the gloom. And there she was, a ghost, a titan, a jagged silhouette against the storm-racked clouds, the Droits de l'Orme. Pellew didn't hesitate. He didn't signal for a council of war. He simply ordered more sail. Now, think about that for a second. In a gale that was already tearing the crests off the waves, Pellew was telling his men to climb into the rigging and unfurl more canvas. It was a masterclass in controlled aggression. Every square inch of sail was a gamble. Too little, and the French giant would vanish into the night. Too much, and the masts would simply snap like dry kindling, leaving them helpless in the trough of the sea. The tactical imagery here is almost cinematic. Imagine the Indefatigable as a scarlet-crested hawk, her red-painted gun streaks flashing through the grey mist, shadowing a wounded, massive whale. The French ship was struggling. She had lost her fore and main topmasts in the previous days of the gale. She was crippled, but she was still a ship of the line. She was like a wounded lion, slow, but still possessing enough jaw strength to crush anything that got too close. As the darkness deepened, the chase became a psychological game of cat and mouse. Pellew knew his nemesis was heading for home. The French commander, Commodore Lacrosse, was desperate to reach the safety of Brest, but to get there he had to sail a precise line. Pellew's goal? To harass, to poke, to prod the giant and force it to make a mistake. Modern sailors talk about heavy weather tactics, but what Pellew was doing was something else entirely. He was using the wind as a leash. He stayed on the French ship's weather quarter. In simple terms, he kept the wind at his back, giving him the power to choose when to strike and when to pull away. The French, burdened by their massive size and damaged masts, were leeward. They were being pushed, slowly but surely, toward the coast of France, toward the rocks. The human drama on the deck was intense. The men were soaked to the bone, their skin raw from the salt, their fingers bleeding from the frozen ropes. But there was no dry repetition of orders. Every man knew the stakes. If they caught her, they'd be legends. If they failed, they'd likely be splinters in the surf. What if I told you that in the middle of this high-speed pursuit, the British sailors were actually cheering? They weren't just professional, they were resolute. They saw the Droits de l'Homme not as a threat, but as prize money. In the modern world, the value of that ship and its cargo would be equivalent to hitting a £10 million jackpot. For a common sailor, this one night could mean the difference between the life of poverty and a comfortable retirement in a seaside pub. But as the clock ticked towards 6:00 HMS, the atmospheric pressure shifted. The wind veered to the northwest. The gale became a hurricane. The two ships were now screaming through the water at speeds that were terrifying for wooden vessels. The Indefatigable was diving so deep into the waves that the water was rushing in through the hawse holes, flooding the decks. Pellew stood on the quarterdeck, his eyes never leaving the French stern. He was waiting for the perfect moment. He didn't want a fair fight. He wanted a slaughter. He was waiting for the French ship to roll in the heavy seas, waiting for that moment when her lower gun ports were submerged and useless. The distance closed. Half a mile. A quarter mile. The French crew began to fire their stern chasers, the smaller guns at the back of the ship. Orange flashes punched through the dark, the smell of sulphur mixing with the salt spray. The hunt was over. The death waltz was about to begin. Pellew turned to his master-at-arms. There was no need for a long speech, just 4 words that have echoed through British naval history ever since. Prepare to rake her. The Indefatigable surged forward, a lean, mean, Razee shadow, ready to defy the laws of naval warfare and take down a giant in the dark. The time for manoeuvring was over. The time for violence had arrived. At 5:30 p.m, the Indefatigable surged across the stern of the Droits de l'Homme, and the world dissolved into a chaotic symphony of crashing timber and screaming iron. Pellew had achieved the holy grail of naval tactics, the raking fire. Imagine a bowling ball being hurled down a narrow hallway. That is what a 24-pound shot does when it enters the stern of a ship. It doesn't just hit one target. It travels the entire length of the deck, smashing through bulkheads, dismounting cannons, and turning every piece of furniture, equipment, and human bone into secondary shrapnel. Because the French were packed so tightly, remember, they had over 700 men on board. There was nowhere for them to hide. The Indefatigable unleashed her broadside with a precision that was purely mechanical. The British gunners, trained to a fever pitch, worked in a rhythmic masterclass of lethality. Load, ram, fire. Load, ram, fire. Load, ram, fire. Every time the Indefatigable rolled on the crest of a wave, she timed her discharge so the ball struck the French hull just as it rose, punching holes into the very vitals of the ship. But the French were not silent. They were the nemesis for a reason. Despite the storm, despite the raking, they fought back with the desperate fury of the Republican Guard. From the high fighting tops of their masts, French musketeers poured a sheet of lead down onto Pellew's deck. This is where the human drama becomes visceral. Imagine standing on a deck that is tilting 40 degrees. The wind is 100 miles per hour. And the air is filled with buzzing bees, the sound of musket balls passing inches from your head. Pellew, ever the resolute commander, didn't flinch. He was the anchor of his crew's courage, but even he couldn't control the ocean. As the two ships drifted closer, the Indefatigable was nearly crushed. The Droits de l'Homme attempted to ram, to use her massive weight to grind the British frigate into the sea floor. Pellew's seamanship was the only thing that saved them. He backed his sails. The ship groaned under the pressure, and he slipped away just as the French bowsprit loomed over his quarterdeck like the arm of a vengeful god. What if I told you that during this exchange, the French were actually trying to launch an infantry assault in the middle of a hurricane? They had soldiers on deck ready to board, but the gap between the ships was a churning cauldron of white foam and black abyss. Anyone who fell between the hulls was pulverized instantly. It was a tactical nightmare. The technical stakes were rising. On the Indefatigable, the masts were literally whipping the wooden beams, bending so far they threatened to shatter. Every time the heavy 24-pounders fired, the recoil was so violent in the wet conditions that the guns would occasionally jump their ring bolts, becoming multi-ton loose cannons sliding across the deck. One mistake here. One mistake here. One gun breaking loose could kill more British sailors than the French fire. But the real horror was happening inside the Droits de l'Homme. Because she was so top-heavy, she was rolling uncontrollably. Each time she leaned over, the sea poured into her lower gun ports. The French sailors were fighting waist-deep in water, surrounded by the floating wreckage of their own ship. They were a masterclass in tragedy. They had the numbers, they had the guns, but they didn't have the agility. Pellew saw the weakness. He signaled his partnership, the HMS Amazon, which had finally caught up. Now the hunt became a pack effort. Like two wolves circling a buffalo, the Indefatigable and the Amazon took turns. One would sweep across the bow, the other across the stern. They were weaving a web of iron around the French giant. The sound was something no modern ear can truly replicate. It wasn't just the boom of the cannons. It was the constant, high-pitched shriek of the wind through the rigging, the crack of the masts, and the thud of solid iron hitting oak at 800 miles per hour. It was an assault on every sense. As the battle passed the 4-hour mark, both ships were unrecognizable. Sails were ribbons. Hulls were jagged mosaics of holes. And the decks were slippery with a mixture of salt water and blood. But Pellew wouldn't let up. He was a predator who had found the jugular. He knew that as long as he kept the pressure on, as long as he kept the French ship from finding its rhythm, the impossible victory was within his grasp. But then, the sea decided to end the debate. The tide was turning, and the wind was pushing all three ships toward the lee shore, the graveyard of the Atlantic. The combat was about to enter its most terrifying phase. Not ship against ship, but man against the very earth itself. The clock had drifted past midnight, and the battle had become a hallucinatory nightmare of salt and fire. But as the Indefatigable and the Amazon continued their relentless circling of the French giant, the environment itself began to change. The waves weren't just hills anymore. They were moving skyscrapers, and beneath the roar of the cannons, a new sound began to emerge. A low, rhythmic, guttural thundering that made the hair on the back of every sailor's neck stand up. The sound of surf. In the heat of the chase, in the nemesis grip of the fight, the three ships had been pushed deep into the Baie d'Ardierne. They were no longer in the open ocean. They were in a trap. To a sailor in 1797, a lee shore in a hurricane was a death sentence. It meant the wind was blowing you directly onto the rocks, and there was nowhere left to turn. Suddenly, the tactical objective shifted. It was no longer about who could fire the fastest broadside. It was about who could defy gravity and physics. The Droits de l'Homme was in a state of total collapse. Her masts were gone. Her rudder was barely responding. She was a 74-gun coffin, drifting helplessly toward the jagged granite teeth of the French coast. But the British weren't safe either. The Indefatigable was shattered. Her rigging was a web of snapped hemp. Her sails were lace, and she had 4 feet of water in her hold. Pellew stood on the quarterdeck, his face crusted with salt, looking at the white foam of the breakers just a few cables away. This was the breaking point. What if I told you that at this moment, the French and British sailors stopped looking at each other through their gun sights? For a brief, flickering moment, the war between nations died. It was replaced by the universal war of man against the sea. On the Droits de l'homme, the screams of the wounded were drowned out by the sound of the hull grinding against the sandbars. The French ship struck first. A sickening, soul-crushing thud that vibrated through the water and into the very hulls of the British ships. The giant had fallen. The Droits de l'homme was hard aground, and within seconds, the Atlantic began to dismantle her. The massive oak timbers, built to withstand the cannons of the Royal Navy, were snapped like dry twigs by the weight of the surf. On the Indefatigable, Pellew had to make a choice that would define his legacy. He saw the Amazon strike the rocks further down the coast. He saw his partnership disappear into the white chaos. Most men would have surrendered to the inevitable. But Pellew was resolute. He ordered the impossible. He told his men to haul on the remaining rags of sail, to tack the ship in a space so narrow it shouldn't have been physically possible. The ship groaned. The wood screamed. The men threw their entire body weight into the ropes, their feet slipping on the blood-slicked decks. This is where the logistics of survival come in. In the modern world, we have engines. We have GPS. Pellew had nothing but a compass he couldn't see. A lead line to measure the depth and the sheer bloody-minded willpower of his crew. If they failed by even 1 degree, they would join the French in the graveyard. The Indefatigable passed so close to the breakers that the spray from the rocks was soaking the men on the leeward side. It was a masterclass in nerve. Pellew stood there, a silent statue of grit, watching the depth markings. By the mark 5.5, 4, the water was disappearing beneath them. Then, a miracle. Or perhaps just the result of every drill Pellew had ever forced his men to perform. The Indefatigable caught a gust. Her bow swung away from the rocks, and she clawed her way back into the deep water. She had escaped the death waltz. But as the sun began to rise on the morning of January 14th, the true scale of the tragedy became clear. Behind them, the Droits de l'homme was a shattered skeleton, with hundreds of men clinging to the wreckage in the freezing surf. The Amazon was a wreck. The victory was complete, but it tasted like ash and salt. The sea had intervened. It had ended the battle, but it had started a humanitarian catastrophe that would haunt Pellew for the rest of his life. The machines had failed. The politics were gone. All that remained was the grit of the survivors and the cold, hard echo of history. The grey dawn of January 14th didn't bring relief. It brought the cold, hard clarity of a death sentence. As the light bled into the sky, Sir Edward Pellew looked out from the shattered quarterdeck of the Indefatigable and saw the true horror of their position. They weren't just near the coast, they were entombed by it. To the south lay the jagged Penmarch rocks. To the east, the breakers of Ordeern Bay. To the north, more reefs. And the wind? The wind was a relentless hammer, blowing straight from the west, pinning them against the shore. This was the final gamble. In the 18th century, a ship in this position was considered embayed. Without an engine to fight the wind, the Indefatigable was essentially a feather being blown toward a wall of knives. Pellew's ship was a wreck. Her masts were wounded. Her rigging was a bird's nest of shredded hemp. And his crewmen, who had been fighting and working for nearly 20 hours without sleep, were at the literal edge of human endurance. What if I told you that the difference between life and death in this moment came down to just a few inches of silk and the masterclass of a single man's nerves? Pellew knew that if he tried to anchor, the cables would snap like thread in the massive Atlantic swells. His only hope was to claw his way out. He had to sail the ship almost directly into the wind, a feat that required every ounce of his technical genius. He ordered the men to press the ship. This is where the military precision of the Royal Navy saved them. Despite the exhaustion, despite the freezing spray that turned the decks into ice rinks, the crew responded. They didn't just pull ropes, they performed a synchronized ballet of survival. Pellew watched the shore. He wasn't looking at the beauty of the French coast. He was calculating the set of the tide and the leeway of his hull. Think of the modern connection here. This is the equivalent of a pilot trying to land a jumbo jet with no engines, no landing gear, and a crosswind that wants to flip the plane upside down. One mistake in the trim of the sails, one moment of hesitation from the man at the helm, and £60 million of British technology and 300 lives would be pulverized. The nemesis was no longer the French, it was the depth. On the Indefatigable, the lead man was constantly casting his line. By the Mark 5. Quarter less 4. The water was thinning. At one point, there were less than 10 feet of water beneath the keel. The ship was literally dancing over the tops of the underwater mountains. The human drama reached its peak when Pellew saw his sister ship, the Amazon, strike the ground. He watched through his glass as the ship that had fought by his side all night was lifted by a gargantuan wave and smashed onto the sand. He couldn't stop. He couldn't stop. He couldn't help. To turn back for them would be to condemn his own men to the same fate. It is the loneliest moment a commander can face, the resolute necessity of leaving friends behind to save the mission. Then came the breaking point of the gamble. Pellew saw a tiny opening, a shift in the wind, a flaw in the gale. He ordered the ship to wear a dangerous maneuver where you turn the back of the ship to the wind to gain momentum. As the Indefatigable swung around, she dipped her rails so deep into the sea that the water rushed across the deck, nearly sweeping Pellew and his officers overboard. For 10 heart-stopping minutes, the ship stood still, balanced between the power of the wind and the pull of the tide. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the compass needle began to move. The Razee hull, with its deep keel and lightened upperworks, did exactly what it was designed to do. It bit into the water. It held its ground. By 11 a.m., the Indefatigable had cleared the Penmarch rocks. They had made it. They had cheated the lee shore. Pellew finally allowed himself to sit. He had been on his feet for 24 hours. His ship was a floating graveyard of wood and iron, but she was still afloat. Behind him, the smoke from the burning Droits de l'Homme rose into the rainy sky, a funeral pyre for a giant and a testament to the man who refused to blink. The gamble had paid off. But as the adrenaline faded, the grit was replaced by a somber realization. The victory was absolute, but the cost was a masterclass in the cruelty of war. As the Indefatigable limped away into the grey mist of the Atlantic, the scene left behind in the Baie d'Ordierne was nothing short of a catastrophe. The echo of this battle wasn't the sound of cheers. It was the sound of 1,000 men screaming against the roar of the surf. The Droits de l'Homme lay broken in 3 pieces, her massive 74-gun frame acting as a jagged cage for the souls trapped inside. For the French, the aftermath was a masterclass in tragedy. Out of the 1,300 souls on board, nearly double her usual complement. Because of the soldiers, only a few hundred would ever see dry land again. For 4 days, the survivors clung to the tilting decks, watched their comrades be swept away by the freezing spray, and resorted to drinking vinegar and salt water in a desperate hallucinatory bid for survival. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was a national trauma for the French Republic. But let's look at the modern connection to this carnage. If you visit the coast of Brittany today, specifically near the town of Plozivette, you can still find the Menhir des Droits de l'Homme. It is a sombre stone monument, marking the mass graves of the sailors who washed ashore. To this day, French divers still explore the seabed there, finding 24-pounder cannons and anchors encrusted in 2 centuries of salt and coral. The value of what was lost that night isn't just in the wood and iron, it's in the DNA of the families along that coast. And what of the British? The HMS Amazon was also a total loss. But here is the human hook, the twist that defines the era. When the Amazon's crew reached the shore, they didn't flee. They marched inland in perfect formation and surrendered as prisoners of war. Because of the great and professional conduct of the British sailors, the French, despite their own suffering, treated them with immense respect. It was a strange 18th century code of honor that seems almost alien to us today. When news of the battle reached London, it was like a lightning bolt. The myth had been shattered. A frigate, a Razee, had successfully hunted and destroyed a ship of the line. The Admiralty was stunned. The public was ecstatic. Pellew was ecstatic. Pellew was the man of the hour. But what if I told you that Pellew himself was haunted? He wrote in his private letters about the dreadful scene of the shipwreck. He was a predator, yes, but he was a man who understood that every enemy sailor was a father, a brother, a son. The tactical fallout changed naval warfare forever. The Royal Navy realized that speed and velocity were often more important than raw mass. They began to invest more in these high-speed, heavy-hitting frigates. It was the birth of a new doctrine, one that would eventually lead to the total British dominance of the seas at Trafalgar. In the modern world, we call this asymmetric warfare. It's the idea that a smaller, more agile force can take down a giant if it chooses the right time, the right place, and the right weapon. Pellew didn't just win a battle, he provided a blueprint for how to fight against the odds. The money, the politics, the machines, they all faded into the background. What remained was the legend of the death waltz in the dark. But every legend has a final chapter. For the Indefatigable, it was a return to the shipyard. For the Droits, it was a slow dissolution into the sand. And for Sir Edward Pellew, it was the beginning of a journey that would take him from the deck of a frigate to the very pinnacle of the British peerage. The echo of the guns had died down, but the story was far from over, because the influence of this one night, this one impossible victory, would ripple down through the centuries, shaping the very identity of the man who would become the greatest naval hero you've probably never heard of. When the smoke finally cleared from the Bidordian, the man who stepped off the battered deck of the Indefatigable was no longer just a captain, he was a national icon. But Sir Edward Pellew wasn't finished with history, and history certainly wasn't finished with him. His victory over the Droits acted as a springboard, launching him into a career that reads like a masterclass in resolute service. He would eventually rise to become Viscount Exmouth, a title that represented the pinnacle of the British peerage. But he never lost that expert-next-door grit. Even as an admiral, even as a peer of the realm, he was still the man who would jump into the surf to save a drowning boy or climb the rigging in a gale. The legacy of that storm-racked night in 1797 didn't just stay on the French coast. It fundamentally altered the DNA of the Royal Navy. If you look at the career of Horatio Nelson, the man who would eventually win the ultimate battle at Trafalgar, you see the fingerprints of Pellew's aggression. Pellew proved that the nemesis wasn't invincible. He showed that British seamanship wasn't just about following rules, it was about breaking them when the moment was right. There is a modern bridge here that is truly remarkable. If you walk through the halls of the Admiralty today, or visit the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, you'll find his portraits. But his real influence is in his lineage. One of his descendants was a pioneer in modern explosives. Another served with distinction in the World Wars. The Pellew spirit, that blend of technical mastery and sheer, bloody-minded courage continued to flow through the veins of the British military for 200 years. And then there is the city of Algiers. In 1816, decades after his duel with the Droits, Pellew was sent to end the scourge of the Barbary pirates and the enslavement of Europeans. He did it with the same tactical precision he used in the hurricane. He anchored his fleet so close to the enemy batteries that the French observers said it was suicidal. But he won. He freed thousands of slaves and earned the nickname the Saviour of Christendom. What if I told you that even today, in the year 2026, the name Pellew still carries a weight of patriotism and grit? There are statues of him in Plymouth, standing tall, looking out toward the horizon where he once hunted the enemies of the crown. His life is a reminder that in the face of a hurricane, or a giant, or a seemingly impossible political crisis, the individual matters. One man, with a clear eye and a resolute heart, can change the trajectory of an entire nation. As we look back at the shipwreck of the century, we shouldn't just see a tragedy or a pile of sunken wood. We should see the echo of history. We see a man who took the tools of his trade, the machines, and pushed them to their absolute breaking point to protect his country. Sir Edward Pellew, Viscount Exmouth, was the architect of a new kind of heroism. He wasn't a myth. He was a masterclass in reality. And as long as the Atlantic gales howl against the coast of Brittany, and as long as the Union Jack flies over a Royal Navy vessel, his story will never truly be over. So, the next time you see a storm rolling in from the west, remember the Indefatigable. Remember the Razee that took on a giant. And remember the man who stood on the quarterdeck, soaked, bleeding, and utterly unshakable.